Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. As tensions surge following reports that President Trump urged Volodymyr Zelensky to concede the Donbass to Russia, and with talk of a potential Trump-Putin summit in Budapest, questions swirl over Washington's shifting stance, Kyiv's defiance, and the impact on US credibility. At the same time, Polish authorities confirmed that 8 people have been detained on suspicion of sabotage, part of a broader Russian-led hybrid war with over 55 arrests in recent months. Joining me to discuss the security and geopolitical implications is Mark Montgomery, Senior Director at the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Montgomery, welcome to TVP World. Thank you for taking the time.
Well, thank you for having me.
So it's a pleasure. So let's start with the hybrid warfare. The cyber attacks have been directed towards Poland and other European countries for a while now by Russia and other actors. But it's become a lot more kinetic, with fires being started in the European Union, and also with parcel bombs being passed or sent through Poland and Romania to Ukraine. How would you characterize this evolution?
Well, first, I think you're right. This is very brazen activity by what we have to suspect is Russia, even more so than in Soviet times in terms of their willingness to combine physical, cyber, and cognitive warfare in a hybrid, in an attempt at pressuring Poland and other Eastern European countries into lessening their support. Whether or not it would have the intended effect, I doubt. But the fact is, someone, most likely Russia, is practicing a high degree of risk taking in conducting these operations and being caught.
So what's the game plan here? Are they probing to see how far they can go before they get a response? Are they actually at war with Central and Eastern European countries already?
So in the cyber world, I think it is probing to some degree. It is determining what's my level of access I can get. Where can I insert malware so I can return at a later date, or gain an access so I can return at a later date, or leave malware behind for a future disruptive event? So the cyber can be about today, but it can also be about tomorrow. But I think the physical attacks are much more about a demonstration, kind of a deterrent, attempted at a deterrent impact on their Eastern European neighbors. So I think two different intended outcomes for the two different types of warfare.
Okay, now Russia isn't, of course, the only actor on the stage playing these cyber warfare games. China, of course, comes to mind. How effective and widespread is Chinese cyber warfare within the EU and the United States?
So I'm glad you highlighted that it really is, for China, it's really much more a cyber game, and maybe some cognitive warfare for some influence operations, but not the physical attack. So the big difference between China and Russia would be China's not so brazen. They don't conduct the physical attack. However, their cyber attacks are, kind of in their capability and capacity even more than the Russian. There's the well-known case here is Volt Typhoon, which is the name of an advanced persistent threat team from China that put their hooks, either accesses or malware, into most of our critical infrastructure sectors, but particularly those associated with military mobility like rail, ports, aviation, and energy. They do an equally aggressive job against Taiwan, and to a more limited degree against Japan. So clearly China is very aggressive in the cyber domain, but much less so in the physical domain.
Right. Now, considering the relationship between China and Russia, are we talking about an amplification of the war that Russia is conducting against the West, simply in partnership with China?
So, I like to I'm careful with this. So when we study the growing relationship between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran here at FDD, I think our findings are that generally in the wartime environment of Ukraine, there is no doubt that Ukraine is at war with Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. All of them, all four countries are conducting warlike activities against Ukraine. In the case of Iran, we know it's the Shahed drones. North Korea, it's troops and ammunition. But China is about backstopping the Russian economy, the Russian war machine, with increases of imports and exports of 35 to 40%, plus microelectronics that make the Russian cruise and ballistic missiles function properly. So, from my perspective, in the physical domain, in the physical domain, in the context of Ukraine, for sure their cooperation is very high. We don't see such as a high cooperation in cyber in geographic areas outside of Ukraine. So I'm not willing to go there yet, but I believe that they're complementary but not integrated.
Right. Well, certainly not yet. Now, how effectively is Europe and the US? How effectively are they dealing with these threats, both by Russia and China?
Well, not very. So what I'll say right up front is neither European NATO countries nor the United States have made the sufficient investments in the cybersecurity of their critical infrastructure protection systems. As I mentioned, rail, aviation, ports, electrical power grids, water, even financial services. All of those lack sufficient investments by the companies and insufficient support by the governments. So none of them are up to the necessary level to compete with Chinese and Russian offensive operations. So all the countries in NATO, and I would go farther and say this applies to Japan and Taiwan and Korea as well, and Asia, need to increase their investments in the cybersecurity of their critical infrastructures.
So a bit of catching up to do. I'd like to move on now to what's happening with regard to President Trump's efforts in terms of stopping the war in Ukraine. How would you characterize President Trump's relationship with President Putin as it stands at the moment?
Well, it's unfortunate. I'm concerned that what we're seeing right now is a Donald Trump once again getting walked back from the right answer, which is increasing support to Ukraine, by flattery and false promises from President Putin. And we've seen that as a result of his phone call early last week, his performance in his bilateral meeting with Zelensky, and what he said in the ensuing few days.
Yeah, the thing is that we often see President Trump kind of swinging from one point of view to the other. Is this simply a tactic that he's using, and really what we should be watching are his actions rather than listening to his words so much?
I hope. So his words will never be right, because you're right. He boomerangs around after every phone call from Putin. He ought to watch Putin's actions. After the phone calls, two things happen. One, immediately his foreign minister Lavrov goes on a rip-roaring anti-Ukrainian, anti-Western tirade, reestablishing, the Russian talking points of no concessions. But secondarily, within 24 to 48 hours, significant drone, cruise, and ballistic missile strikes impact Kiev, and particularly civilian targets in Ukraine that kill civilians and take out electrical power grids. So Putin's actions, Putin's rhetoric, don't match his conversations with Trump. What we need from Trump is, I don't think we'll ever change his rhetoric, how he talks about himself, but we could get some consistent action where U.S. intelligence support remains in place, U.S. defense industrial base remains open for business, and the United States allows Ukraine to buy the appropriate weapons, offensive weapons systems like ATACMS and the extended range attack munition, potentially Tomahawk, although I'm not as enamored with that, and then defensive weapon systems, Patriot, AMRAAM, and some of the counter-drone systems that the United States is starting to develop. Those are the kind of actions we need from President Trump.
Right. Well, look, as always, we shall be watching with bated breath to see what happens next. What does this mean for Europe's efforts in terms of stepping up to plug the gap with Ukraine?
Well, I think Europe needs to continue to do what it's promised, which is to provide the funding to either buy European or United States produced weapons. For the foreseeable future, what Ukraine is going to require the U.S. defense industrial base for a majority of its high-end warfighting gear. But Europe can buy that, and so far, by all indications, President Trump has continued to keep that door open. The other thing I'd be doing if I was Europe is working hard on the F-16 support. A bunch of European countries gave F-16s to Ukraine, but they didn't get the normal life cycle maintenance packages. And I spent quite a bit of time in Ukraine, and my takeaway from talking with the F-16 units is that they really do need that increased maintenance support, training support, supply support, and pilot initial throughput support. All those have to come together. So this very valuable weapon system that impacts the battlefield daily and is a gift from the European nations is allowed to achieve its maximum capability and capacity.
Right. I mean, the full-scale invasion started in February 2022. Right. That's 3.5 years ago. Do you think Europe has been behaving in a united way since then and finally has got its act together?
Well, first, we have to acknowledge Europe has given more security assistance than the United States, not just security and humanitarian, security assistance alone. And that's worth acknowledging. So they've done that. They could have been faster. Europe can't rewind the clock and have a effective defense industrial base. That's something that they began giving up 35 years ago. And 10 years ago, they were in extremis. And 3 years ago, at the beginning of the war, they're in severe extremis. So yes, they can't fix that, but they can buy the weapons from the United States and give some of their own weapon systems. What Europe can also do now, stepping up, is collectively provide that $130 billion in frozen Russian funds, so that Ukraine can take loans against it and begin to rebuild both its military, but also important parts of its critical infrastructure that have been under daily and weekly attack from Russian cruise ballistic missiles and drones.
Well, I think many would agree with you. The sooner the better, Mr. Montgomery. Thank you very much indeed for sharing your time with our audience. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye. And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, though. Lots more coming up. Goodbye.